Today's scripture comes from the 10th chapter of the book of Acts. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up into heaven. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of his holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
This morning I want to talk to you about table manners. And when I was thinking about this, things from my childhood flashed through my mind as maybe they would yours. So let me start with a couple of questions to ask. Do you remember the first time you ever sat down to a meal with someone that you didn't know or that you were trying to impress? And then you made the mistake of ordering something from the menu that you didn't know how to eat? Or how about when you were a kid and you ate dinner at a friend's house for the first time and they had food you didn't recognize? I've had those experiences. You can tell a lot about a person by their table manners. Listen to this quote. "Nothing indicates a well-bred man more than a proper mode of eating. A man may pass muster by dressing well and may sustain himself tolerably in conversation. But if he is not perfectly table-mannered, dinner will betray him." That was written in 1836. Table manners are an important part of our lives, and sometimes in today's world, I'm not sure that table manners get taught much, or that we pay much attention to table manners. Do you remember some of the table manners that you were taught when you were growing up? Anyone? Table manners? No elbows on the table?
Chew with your mouth closed.
Chew with your mouth closed, of course. Napkin on your lap? No slurping your soup? All important table manners. Well, if you go online, which I love to do, you can find all sorts of places that will tell you exactly how to be polite in company when you're eating, how to place your fork, your napkin, all those kinds of things. But I found just 10 from Emily Post. She's one of the authorities on this. So let me just read these real quickly. And some of these you already got. 1, chew with your mouth closed. Now, here's one that's been added of late. Keep your smartphone off the table and set it to silent or vibrate. Wait to check calls and texts until after you're finished with the meal and away from the table. This is not one we are living by. Don't use your utensils like a shovel or stab your food. Don't pick your teeth at the table. Remember to use your napkin. Wait until you're done chewing to sip or swallow a drink. Choking is an exception to that if you need something to help you not choke. Cut only one piece of food at a time. Avoid slouching, and don't place your elbows on the table while eating. Instead of reaching across the table for something, ask for it to be passed to you. And then the 10th one I think is important. It says, take part in the dinner conversation. All important rules of etiquette when it comes to having proper table manners. There's a Middle Eastern proverb that goes like this. It says, "I saw them eating and I knew who they were." in today's world, that might not seem to make sense. But I think if you think back to your childhoods and maybe even to your present day eating out and eating with families, that oftentimes I think we can probably tell who people are by the way that they eat. Many different customs come along with eating food, whether you use utensils or not, and those kinds of things. Whether or not you eat from a community bowl or everybody gets their own plate. There's all sorts of things that come with eating that tell about who we are. I think, though, in this day and age when everybody seems to be hurrying quickly to get from one place to another, and we have those drive-through restaurants, I eat a lot in the car, and around the television set. I'll just admit to that. But I know that sometimes I think that we, hopefully as families with kids growing up, that you spend some time around the table once in a while where everybody is attentive to what's being eaten and shared, and that there's community being developed. In biblical times, and even today, the folks that are Jewish they take very seriously their eating together and the importance of meals. And you could say that eating together for them is, well, it's a religious experience. Because they don't just eat food together, they celebrate their faith each and every time they gather for supper, especially on the Sabbath. And there's very specific rules that have to be followed in order for this to be the meal that it's supposed to be. And of course, we know from biblical stories that cleanliness was a very important part of eating and a meal. That you had to have clean food and clean dishes and clean hands and clean hearts. So when the Jewish folks gathered to eat together, they gathered as believers that God had given them these gifts that they were about to partake from. And that they had much to be thankful for the opportunity even to be able to sit together and eat. For them it was a moment to stop, to sit, and to listen, to hear the stories again of their ancestors, and to celebrate. Dinner was a special occasion. Now, we also know that when Jesus came along, that he kind of got a little off track, some thought, because he began to eat with all sorts of people. People that other folks didn't think he should be eating with. I'm thinking that Jesus was just happy to have a meal as he traveled around, depending upon others to feed him. And you might say that when people saw who he ate with, they thought they knew who he was. Because in their mind, the people that Jesus ate with told them that he had lost all sense of what was right and proper, that he was eating with sinners, and that he was turning his back to their traditions, to the people who raised him. And I do need to tell you that I think this is interesting, that the people in Jesus' time that were considered sinners fell into 5 categories. First, there were people who did dirty things for a living. These were like pig farmers and tax collectors. I thought it was interesting that those 2 things were together. There were people who did immoral things, like liars and adulterers. There were people who did not keep the law, those that didn't live up to the commandments and the laws, and that were, of course, judged by religious authorities. And then there were the Samaritans and then the Gentiles. These were the people who were considered sinners. And if you look back on these, you'll know that Jesus ate with all of those at one time or another. And so our scripture this morning is talking to Peter, and I'm going to take a stab at this and say it was about table manners. We know Jesus' stories were always not what they were about, right? But this one has a double meaning. And so let me remind you that the story takes place in our scripture readings. Peter is in Caesarea. He's visiting. There's a man named Cornelius. Actually, he's going to Caesarea. He's in Joppa. the man named Cornelius also has a vision before Peter has his. And in this vision, and it says in the scripture that he was a centurion. So he's not Jewish and he's not a Christian. He's not a follower of Jesus yet. So Cornelius also has a vision. And in this conversation that he has with God, God tells him, you need to send some of your men over to Joppa to find Peter and bring him back to your house. So now we move on to where Peter is, and he also now has a vision. And it's about things that are unclean to eat. And you know, shellfish, things with hooves, that's not what Jewish people eat. So those things are now on this tablecloth in front of Peter. And Peter says, God, Lord, I can't eat that stuff. You know, I've never defiled myself with eating those things. And then God says, nothing that I have created is unclean. So yes, for a moment, God is talking to Peter about food. But we know that when the folks arrive from Cornelius' household, that Peter is going to have to come to an understanding that it's not just food that he's being told about that isn't unclean. Peter had to learn some basic table manners. And that meant that he had to learn to include other people at his table. Now, I don't know what your customs are as families about who you invite to eat with you, but who you eat with, even today, is a sign of who you are and what you value and cherish. And when we eat with people that we're unfamiliar with, if we eat with people that we're unfamiliar with, it can sometimes put us in situations where we feel uncomfortable. But I think that this holds true, and I would challenge you to remember that the greatest of conversations, the greatest of relationships are built around a table where food is being served. And so this was a really important lesson for Peter to learn. That there were people that were going to come into Peter's life that he would at first think were unclean. But that God wanted him to know that nothing that God had created was unclean. And it goes beyond just food, and it goes to people. So I think if we're going to talk about table manners and maybe some things that are implied by the story that we have in our scripture today, I'm going to say that I think that first God wanted Peter to learn that he needed to eat whatever was put on his plate. I had that experience as a kid, maybe you did too. You eat what's there and be grateful for it. God wanted Peter, because he represented those new Christians, those Jewish Christians. He wanted Peter to understand that the Gentiles, that those folks that were considered unclean were a part of the covenant, that they were valuable and worthy. And even more importantly, I think God wanted Peter to know that these Gentiles did not need to necessarily adhere to the Jewish ceremonial laws when it came to the food that they ate and how they ate it and who they ate with. So I think Peter needed to learn that when God puts something in your plate or on your plate, or when God puts someone in your life, you need to accept them just as they are. And then I think another thing that God wanted Peter to learn was that in order to have good table manners, you couldn't be rude to your guests. I've been at parties where this doesn't always happen, where sometimes things don't go well. But I think sometimes we also go out of our way to make people feel uncomfortable if we want them to know that we think that something they're doing isn't what we think they should be doing. But Jesus went to the home of the tax collectors, you remember? And he ate with them. Those people who were considered unclean. And I think Peter was learning that everything and everyone was a part of God's plan and part of God's people. And I think God still wants us to remember that God sends all sorts of people into our lives. And that we don't get to decide who gets to hear the gospel message. That it isn't ours to determine whether someone is worthy or valuable or a sinner. They all are entitled to hear God's message. And I think another lesson that God wanted Peter to learn was that you can't be greedy with what you have, especially when it comes to food and hospitality. That you don't get to hold on to things for yourselves and not include others. And that when people are hungry, their spiritual hunger needs as much attention as their physical hunger. And Peter needed to know that the Gentiles that lived so supposedly differently than the Jews had a hunger in them that needed to be filled, that their spirits were hungry. And I think the other thing was, and I learned this as a kid too, when we were at family reunions, sometimes we had more people than we had space at the table. But we had a word, maybe you've used this word, it's called scooch. I don't know if you use that word or not. But we had to scooch over and make room. And I think God is telling Peter, it's time for you to scooch over and make room at the table. That you don't get to exclude someone because you don't think that there's room. Because everyone has a place at God's table. You see, I think that's the remarkable message that we get from Christ, is that everyone is invited to the table. So let me ask you to think about this, because it's Communion Sunday, especially. How are your table manners? Who do you know that needs to be at our table that's not here? And I want you to think for a moment that the greatest dinner party of all is the one that we recreate each time we gather for communion. So who needs to be invited to come and eat with us?